Good morning to all my friends and family, and welcome to yet another episode of Jim's 5am Club. It's Friday morning. We're slowly nearing the last days of winter. It's the 25th of August, and it's my wife Paula's birthday today, so happy birthday, Paula. Katakatosisis me here, and wishing you and all of us many happy and healthy returns. It's going to be a most beautiful day today by the looks of things. As you can see on the horizon there, it's just starting to light up and brighten up, and over the next 15 or so minutes whilst I do this vlog, you'll see the skyline transform from darkness to light. And what I'd like to do today is to introduce you to yet another book summary in the tradition of Jim's 5am Club, what I try and do on a regular basis, and this is number 1562. What I try and do is I try and share wherever I can, OPE, other people's experiences in the form of book summaries, where we can just think about things, talk about things, contemplate things, and see if we can incorporate it into our lives and make it one of our skill sets to enable us to have patterns of excellence that we can refer to and use, so that we can live a better life, and not only that we can live a better life, but that we can use and pass on to family, friends and others. The title of today's book summary that I'm going to go through is called Free Your Mind, by a dual authorship of Laura Dodsworth and Patrick Fagan. This book is an interesting book, is a timely book, and has been recently put together, and is a book which I guess looks a little bit deeper into how propaganda works and how governments and marketing agencies and other people use certain techniques to influence and in some ways manipulate the populace. And the authors have an interesting sort of background as well, in that Patrick Fagan is a behavioural scientist that works for a marketing organisation, and we've got to understand that marketing people, advertisers, governments, corporations all have access to the science behind behavioural impacts, and in some ways they use this science of brainwashing to influence and impact people within the community, in good ways and in bad ways. I think it's important to understand that the techniques used for behavioural science and brainwashing can be used to manipulate. And manipulate is not necessarily a bad word, it just means to change one's point of view. But the risk is always that if you have an open mind, and Western society, seems to support and to encourage people having open minds, but one of the risks of being too open-minded is that your mind becomes a cesspool, becomes a rubbish tip for everybody else's garbage. So we need to be on guard, and this book here basically encourages us to stay on guard, to be on guard, and to look out for the techniques and the tricks that other people use in order to try and brainwash us, the propaganda, the tricks, the things they do to trap us and to keep us on the straight and narrow, and to enable us to play with the cards that they deal. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand the science behind brainwashing and understanding how manipulation works in television, in the food industry, in the alcohol industry, in drugs. Because what people don't understand is that once you're hooked, then you tend to become an addict. So the trick is to avoid being hooked, to avoid being turned into an addict, and to understand how branding and advertising and fear-mongering all works. Because we live in a world where we're continually bombarded. We're continually bombarded by information, both information, misinformation, and can I also add disinformation? And it's up to us to try and figure out, what is what, and it all depends on the sources that you tap into, the people you hang out with, and the things you read. So once again, it is tricky, because once you're hooked, once you get swept up into an agenda, into a way of thinking, into a particular social circle, that it's hard to extract yourself without feeling the pain that comes with being manipulated. Because each group, each agenda, each political sort of thought process has rules of engagement, and those rules, I guess, need to be followed, and if you don't follow them religiously, then you do risk being ostracized and made to look a fool, and in fact even cancelled in today's society. So what we come across is some new terms such as nudging, terms such as stacking, trigger stacking, and other words and other new terms that what we'll do is we'll go through and try and understand. And they're new terms which basically describe old things. So what happens in today's society is that people come up with new terms to describe concepts that are time tested and very, very old indeed. So the trick is not to get fooled by these new words, by these new colloquial sort of terms, but to understand that it's the same old thing, just described differently. So the author also goes on to say that if you don't stand guard to your mind, and you just let the media, you just let the television, you just let social media, you let your friends, your family, and other people loose, then what may result is an impact on one's mental health, because we live in a world now that is full of anxiety, and the different things between feeling anxious and feeling depressed is that anxiety has to deal with the future. The people who have high anxiety are the ones who spend far too much time thinking about tomorrow, worrying about tomorrow, and being too caught up with tomorrow, whereas the people who feel depressed or are caught up in depression are at the opposite end of the spectrum. They are the people who tend to spend more time caught up in the past, their past, whereas the best place to be is to have a foot in both the past and the future, but like a bell curve, to have your whole body in the present, because we only have the present, we only have the here and now, and there is no doubt that we're all going to have experienced a different past. We're all going to experience, and most certainly experience, a different future from each other, and we're all going to experience a different here and now. For example, I am here, you're somewhere else. You're going to have a completely different perspective to what I have at the moment, because you're in a different place, and you could be even a different sort of time sphere as well, watching this video at a later time of the day or a later time of the year, or maybe years in advance. So today we need to understand that we live in a world of free thinking and free speech, which doesn't necessarily mean good thinking and good speech. We have things such as truth verifiers, we have fact checking, and we have a lot of confirmation bias. We have people who claim to be scientists. We have people who claim to be economists, all foisting their opinions upon us. But like when you put 2 Greeks into a room, or 10 Greeks into a room, you're never going to get anybody being in consensus. Everybody's going to have a different opinion, even though they all claim to be scientists, they all claim to be economists, they all claim to be educated. The fact remains that we live in a world that has many different views, some right, some wrong, and you just don't know, because nobody's been to the future. We need to make this point very, very clear. Nobody's been to the future, and nobody knows what today holds, let alone tomorrow and years ahead. And we're all going to have very different futures, just because we all have very different faiths. Just because you think it's true, just because it's worked for you, or worked for your parents, or worked for somebody else, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for me, my community, or anybody else. Everybody seems to think that they have the version of the truth, but there is only one truth, and that truth, of course, is Jesus. That truth is God and is with God. The rest of it is all just opinion. And reality is, each and every one of us are going to live, each and every one of us are going to live slithers of reality. And the reality slither that I experience is going to be extremely different to the reality slither that you're going to experience. And we're all going to concatenate and to stack slither upon slither upon slither, but we're all going to have a different outcome and a different worldview, which is for sure. So we need to be careful about what we think, who we hang out with, what we read, because everybody has a different slither, everybody has a different view, but we all need to try and balance it up with the one and only truth. The author here talks about confirmation bias, and to understand that everybody is biased in their views based on how they see the world, based on how they've been brought up, the fears, the anxieties, the doubts that they have inherited from their families and from others, and to know that there are people out there trying to censor us, trying to change our view, trying to change our truths. But as we say, each and every one of us have slithers of reality that could be right, could be wrong, but at the end of the day, those slithers influence us in a dramatic and significant way. The important thing to understand is that we are surrounded by people who want to play on our fears, our prejudices, and our anxieties, our fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And propaganda is what plays on people's emotions. And at the end of the day, you just can't repress anxiety. And what propaganda does, what the media does, and what some people do, is they try and amplify our emotions of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They stack our emotions. And this is what this whole thing is all about. When these authors talk about trigger stacking, is where they seem to identify and express to us and explain to us that each person has different triggers, each person has different fears, anxieties and doubts that have been accumulated throughout their lives based on different inputs. And what the author here is saying is that if you stack one upon another, we're able to deal with one issue at a time. We're able to deal with one trigger at a time. But when you stack them one upon the other, what potentially happens is that we can get overwhelmed. And this is what propaganda does, this is what the media does, this is what some people do, is that they understand how to impact and identify these triggers in people, and they just keep on repeating them over and over again until you get to the point where you have the piece of straw or the stick that broke or breaks the camel's back. What we're saying here is that we need to try and deflect where possible the huge amounts of information that gets thrown at us every day, that gets put on our shoulders, that becomes a burden in the backpack that we carry. We need to lighten the load, and the only way to lighten the load is to have the cognitive dissonance, to push it away, to be very, very careful and selective with the information that you accept, and just to push away like water off a duck's back the things which are just going to lead to suffering, disappointment and emptiness, and to be a voice of reason in your family and in your environment, and to try and speak up early and take a stand, because what happens is that there's a thing called radical incrementalism, which we see it happening all the time in our society, where you give an inch and they take a mile. So what you need to do is you need to understand and try and second guess where things are heading and how it's going to impact you, and to take a stand, to push back, and to know that society changes incrementally, step by step, and it's these little steps that people accept that lead them down a path of no return. So the person who doesn't stand for anything eventually falls for everything, is the message that comes from this author. So this radical incrementalism and this trigger stacking is important to understand, because you need to push back. You need to be aware that there are people, there is the media, there are interests out there that are trying to manipulate you, our children, our communities in a negative way. And the only way to do it is to keep guard at your mind, to understand what your values are, to reaffirm your values, to understand what your values are, and to protect those values at every opportunity. Else, you wake up one day, you look in the mirror, and you no longer recognize the person that is in that mirror, for they have changed so much within one generation that all that their parents and forefathers had handed to them has been displaced, has been swapped out by the garbage that some minorities want to foist upon us. So the important thing is to be careful, because if you change and that change slowly gains momentum, before you know it, you won't be able to turn back. You won't be able to do anything about it. The other thing is that we are constantly in a battle with social media, as social media is a platform of shallow, quick and rapid communication, which overstimulates us from an information and an emotional perspective. You know, we basically these days have very little time to think, and most certainly we've got little time to think slowly and precisely, because we live in fear, uncertainty and doubt. We live with emotion, and we can't basically break away from being in a primitive state of fight, flight, or just fight, flight, or freeze. That's the three: fight, flight, or freeze. And all we're doing is, because we're so emotional, because we're so overwhelmed, all we can do is react and not respond. So we can't think about what is happening. We can't think rationally. And this is where the media, this is where propaganda works very, very effectively, because all you're doing is reacting emotionally as opposed to responding rationally and in a balanced way. We're given false binaries, we're trigger stacked, and once you understand how this works, once you see it in practice, you can't ever unsee it ever again. And the way they do this trigger stacking is they do a couple of things, and then they link it to something which is really emotional and really popular, such as climate change, and it creates emotional landmines. So we need to be psychologically resistant to this manipulation, and to once again understand what we stand for, and to stand what we stand for, else we become manipulated, we become damaged. And once you get down a certain path, once they take an inch, as we said, they'll take a mile, and you'll never ever be able to recover, because you've just given up too much time, too much room and too much space, and the war, the battle is lost. Anyway, take care everybody. Yasas, wishing you all the best, and we'll chat again. Bye for now.